A 70 años del primer Congreso Nacional de Filosofía para transformar presente y futuro.
Laws are written by men and women. Even those who claim that the laws are dictated by God, it is dictated to a man or to a group of men. So laws written by men can change, and the law is just a reflection at one stage of history of the power relation that exists in given societies. So you can have laws which are embodiment of the human rights advances, or you can have law that restrict human rights application. Now, the implementation is a different story, but the first field of struggle in human rights is to ensure that the laws reflect the international agreements on human rights, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the various covenants and treaties. How it is reflected in domestic law and how it is implemented depends on the power relation that exists between, broadly speaking, the people and those who in parliament represent the ruling classes. So there is no surprise that you will have gaps between domestic law and international treaties, and also between domestic law and implementation. Because those who feel that their privileges are being questioned by these new laws will do anything they can to resist implementation, including using the justice system. So it's the mission of the human rights activist to ensure, one, that the law reflects international treaties, and two, that the laws that are enacted by Parliament are faithfully implemented. Well, I would say the biggest challenge to implementing human rights law is the continuous existence of impunity, especially if I take the context of Africa. Most African countries now have in their constitution all the elements of international human rights law. The problem is impunity. The problem is political will to implement what is now contained in the law. And therefore, it rests with the vigilance of civil society organizations to make sure, one, that the law reflects international commitment of governments, and two, that the law which is developed is implemented equally. Yeah, well, I'm not a philosopher. I think that whether you refer to Kant, whereby no one should be a means to an end, or if you read, what's his name again, Hannah Arendt.
Yes.
Dignity is beyond rational definition. It's not just reason. It's also the emotions. It's about how we react to injustice. And to me, that's the best approach to human rights, which is something that is common to all human beings, that we are all outraged when we are confronted with certain action that diminish people, that create injustices, inequalities. And it is this emotional reaction that is then maybe rationalized by philosophers to explain why respect for dignity is the best way to achieve peace and justice in the world. Because as human beings, we are endowed with the same crucial element which make us human beings above animal. We react in the same way. Not everybody, of course. You have those people who, for sake of greed or power are ready to trample on the humanity of other human beings, degrading their own humanity in the process. Because when you attack the dignity of somebody else, you are demeaning your own dignity and your own humanity. So for me, dignity and humanity are coexistent. It's the same thing. It's something that maybe you cannot define rationally, but which define all of us, all human beings. And now, the relationship with human rights, either you can look at human rights as the attributes of what protect dignity, what is necessary to protect dignity, living with no fear, with no want, living with respect and self-respect, and not doing to others what you will not want others to do to you.
How to stimulate human rights activism?
Through education. I think, and of course when I talk about education, it's not just institutional education. Education starts in the family, because it is in the family that you learn, like Nelson Mandela used to say, nobody is born a racist. So it is in the family that you learn how to respect others or to disrespect others. So it starts in the family, and then through the system of education, and through education for the respect of the law, but also education for the need to engage in society to change laws that are not good laws, or to ensure that the laws are implemented. Even in the United States, I see critical reflection and critical theory in deconstructing race and racism. I think it is becoming very powerful, the discourse on race and racism, especially with the advance of genetics, which prompt a new narrative on race and racism, colonialism and decoloniality is also a new element in our countries. In
Latin America too.
That's right. And I would add the whole debate on poverty. We started in UNESCO 10 years ago a reflection on poverty as a violation of human rights. I worked with him. We produced 4 books on poverty as a human rights violation with philosophers, sociologists, economists, etc. It is important because that affirmation leads to a change in strategy for the fight against poverty. If you define poverty,
Change our focus.
yeah, and it's a change of paradigm. Because if you define poverty as a violation of human rights, then it means the response to poverty is abolition. It's a new language. And it's only through abolition of poverty, like we did abolition of slavery, it's only through the abolition of poverty that you can eradicate it, because you posit poverty then as a human rights issue, as a human rights struggle, and therefore as an affront to human dignity. Poverty is seen as a matter of development and as a matter of empowerment of people, or as an approach that will blame the poor for not being able to use all the opportunities offered in a free society. But that we know that it is not true. If you posit poverty as a human rights violation, then you have to go after those who maintain people in poverty, those who prevent people from moving out of poverty. You have to look at the laws to see whether the laws are consistent with anti-poverty strategy. So it's battle of idea.
Yes.
So it is how you impose a different reading of what is going on in society. If you succeed in imposing that reading, then you impose a different course of action.
It's a political challenge.
It is political and philosophical challenge.
Now, which are the biggest challenges for human rights today?
We still have the old challenges until today. Poverty is one, because it affects 50% of the world population. It kills more than anything else. You have racism, intolerance, religious bigotry, and all the attitude associated with intolerance. You have violence against women, which is, again, something that you find in all societies all over the world, all different types of violence. But then you have new challenges because of the new technological realities that we are confronted with, linked to intelligence, artificial intelligence. We see the tech giants, etc., and the challenges it poses for the tension between freedom of expression and tolerance. Climate change will have impact on movement of people and migrations. I would say there is a third big challenges linked to one of the consequences of climate change, but not necessarily linked to that, migration. And how societies which initially pretended to be homogeneous, when confronted with economic difficulties, they have to divert the attention of the people and identify scapegoats in order to deflect their own responsibilities. So multiculturalism and democracy, the combination of the two, will be one of the challenges of the future, because people are on the move anyway, we like it or not.
How to create a new dialogue between Africa and Latin America without the interference from European synthesis?
Yeah, well, that's one of my personal commitments. Since the 1970s, I've been visiting Latin America for 40 years. I've been to most Latin American countries, from Dominican Republic, Mexico, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Brazil, the Caribbean, Haiti, etc., the whole Latin America. For me, I say three things. First, we cannot just keep our frame of mind on the basis of history. We have to look at geography. Africa and Latin America are neighbors. From my country, Senegal, to Brazil, if you have a direct flight, it's 4 hours.
4 hours?
4 hours. From Dakar to Fortaleza.
4 hours?
4 hours. If you had a direct flight. From Dakar to Haiti, it's 6 hours, because Dakar to New York is 7 hours. So the first thing is we are neighbors, but we are neighbors that look each on the other side, look up. In Africa, we look up Europe, and in Latin America, you look up to America. So that's the first thing. The second thing, you have a lot of commonalities in culture, because Latin America is the second biggest African population in the world. Brazil, 60% of the Brazilian population identifies with African descent. You take all the Caribbeans, Colombia is 55%, Venezuela is 40%. So you have a continent called Latin America, but it could have been called African America because of the presence of African populations, yes, since the time of slavery. Some historians even say before that, but let us just stick to modern times, since the 15th, 16th century. And that has impacted on the culture of Latin America. So you have similarities between Latin American culture and African culture. Food, music, football. So you have a lot of commonalities in terms of population and culture. And three, it's common interest. We know that
The fight against poverty, for example.
yeah, but even in terms of future development, why is China so welcome in Africa and in Latin America in terms of future development? Because we know that the approach of China is different from the approach of North America and the approach of Europe. And that's why China is so welcome, because of its win-win strategy. Now, of course, behind that, you may have interests that they pursue as a nation. Each nation will pursue its interests. But we are winning more through that partnership that we have in the past 100 years with Europe. So we have common interests, we have commonalities in terms of culture, we have common future, and we are neighbors. And the first relation you develop in your environment is with your neighbors, not with foreigners, quote unquote. So I think that it is unfortunately something that we neglect, especially since Lula, Chavez, and Correa left, because they were really the champion of this rapprochement between Africa and Latin America. And on the side of Africa, you have Thabo Mbeki in South Africa, Laurent Gbagbo in Côte d'Ivoire, Obasanjo in Nigeria, who were also the champion of this rapprochement. But all of them are gone. And that rapprochement was seen with suspicion by European powers and American powers. They don't want that. So I think that it is essential for me, that I've been preaching that for 40 years, when I was at UNESCO, when I was at Amnesty International. We have a lot to learn from Latin America, and you have a lot to learn from Africa.
We know that. We know
Yeah.
that.
So I think it is important. I keep to preach that. Now, of course, if Latin America want to engage seriously with Africa, the question is not what can we do for Africa, is what can we do with Africa together. And I think that is really essential. So I know it will take time. I know that people will not see that necessarily as indispensable, especially in the context of Latin America. People will not see that as necessary in the context of Africa, but I believe that it is important to preach that, and slowly, step by step, by increasing contacts, exchanges, migrations, etc. I think we will see that happening, because it's the best way forward for Latin America and Africa. Interference will always be there. I mean, the Americans complain that the Russians have interfered in their democracy, but America has been interfering in the democracy in all over the world for 200 years. That's what they do all the time. So interference will be there. But I think if there is a good understanding that it is in our common interest, Africa and Latin America. And I must add, that will only happen after Latin America has done its own historical work on the slavery period and recognized that through that period of slavery, it has committed crimes against humanity, crimes against Africa. It has to come to terms with that. That was one of the discussions in Durban at the World Conference on Racism and Xenophobia and Discrimination. There were a lot of Latin American groups and also Afro-Latins who attended the conference. And to me, the cooperation, the increased cooperation between Africa and Latin America has to come through a phase of atonement, whereby you contribute to the reconciliation in Latin America between the black population and, that's right, in Brazil, for instance. Yes, by addressing the injustices that continue to exist against the black population right nowadays. That's right. So it is recognition of the past through policies in the present. And Lula had started doing it through his policies on affirmative action, opening universities to black kids, etc., and lifting people out of poverty, mostly black and mestizos.
Human rights policy.
Exactly. So it had started doing that. I think it is through those policies that will prepare the ground for a strong cooperation. That's right. Because in Africa, maybe they will not say it, but it will be in the back of their mind.
Yes.
In Latin America, also, they will not say it, but it is in the back of their mind. So I think we need to come clean with that past. It's the past, it's the past.
You are completely right.
It's the past, but it's the consequences of the past to the present that we need to address, and that we can address it collectively between Latin America and Africa. So those best placed to do that are the human rights activists, the universities, the civil society organizations. They are the one best to do that, and business, because business wants opening in Africa. Okay, like China is coming to Africa. Latin American business can have opening to Africa, and they will have an advantage. They will have an advantage because they have a large population coming from Africa. So you see, the bond will be easy to establish. China is culturally very different from Africa, but Latin America, that's not the case. The difference between this university and the more traditional university is that these universities are embedded into their community. They see as their moral obligation to address the problems that the community are facing. If you go to the US, for instance, take the University of Columbia in New York. The University of Columbia in New York is in the middle of Harlem. And you have many universities which are built in the middle of poor communities, but they don't see the communities around them. It's like, ivory tower, okay, where they impart knowledge, they do research, but they don't feel a responsibility for social transformation. Social transformation through theory, that's good, but I think your theory is, yes, and your theory will be more powerful if it derives from concrete action, and that concrete action is the start, is the community where you, so that the community will then appropriate the university. They will not see the university as something, as a foreign implant, but they will see it as part of the community. They will be involved in defending the university, and they will be the first beneficiaries of what the university is doing. So I think this is the model of the future, and these are the universities that will eventually transform society and transform the state.
Más información en congresonacionaldefilosofía.org.